Welcome, and for most of you, welcome back, and congratulations. It is likely that if you're listening today and interested in the FCC's RDOF long-form application, that you survived the auction and that you know you've won a collection of CBGs offered in that auction. Now that you've won, what do you do next? My name is Jim Stegman. I am president of CostQuest, and I will be leading a long-form discussion with John Wilkins and Steve Coran. During 3 pre-recorded sessions and 1 live event, we will be walking you through the FCC's Form 683, referred to as the long form. Our goal is to make it easier for awardees to work through the long form. We've dug through the requirements, synthesized them, and added our insights on what to look out for. These videos, accompanying material, and the live Q&A are meant to be a guide for your efforts. In the first session, we overviewed the requirements of the long form and noted that it's not just necessarily a matter of filling out the application by the deadline. This is a detailed process to complete the form, and you really need to start now. Keep in mind that the FCC staff will go so far into the weeds that you may not be able to see where they're at. In the second session, we dug a bit deeper into the requirements for audited financial statements, ETC designation, your letter of credit, and your bankruptcy code opinion letter. In this third and final session, we will wrap up with an in-depth discussion of the description of your technology and system design. We hope you find these pre-recorded sessions informative. We will hold a live discussion on December 15th. In this live discussion, we will answer pre-submitted questions along with live questions. As such, I would encourage you to register for the live event on our website and submit your questions. And before we begin, one last item. As part of our support for you, we have set up an RDOF resource page at www.costquest.com, and I would encourage you to look at that. Now, let's dive in. Let me first reintroduce the panel to you. I am Jim Stegman, President and CEO of CostQuest. We are experts in economic, geospatial, and network modeling. Notably, we developed the CACM and ACAM models used by the FCC for CAF funding. Our models were used to set the reserve price in the RDOF auction. And finally, with the recent creation of our broadband fabric, we now have the exact latitude and longitude of virtually every location that has or needs broadband in the US. John Wilkins is one of the co-founders of Quadra Partners, an advisory firm with teams in Washington and New York. He is a past chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and managing director at the FCC, during which time he was heavily involved in both policy and operations related to all universal service programs. And Steve Coran is chair of Lerman Center's Broadband Spectrum, Utilities, and Communication Infrastructure Practice Group. He represents broadband providers, equipment and technology companies, and new technology firms serving their policy, transactional, compliance, and licensing needs. He actively represents a trade association before the FCC, Congress, and other federal agencies, and has participated in proceedings that establish the CAF and RDOF rules. Steve has worked extensively with CAF recipients and RDOF applicants throughout the short form and long form processes, and with respect to post-award reporting and compliance. So let's start the discussion on the description of technology and system design. So first, from an overview standpoint, you'll need a detailed description within, I can't think of the date, January 20 something, we'll find that. After release of closing of the public notice, where the FCC released who won, which actually happened today. You'll need to describe the network to be built and upgraded. You'll need to demonstrate the project's feasibility. You'll need to include a network diagram that is certified by a professional engineer. You'll have to detail how requisite performance requirements will be met with service to at least 95% by the end of year 6, and for the duration of the 10-year support, assuming 70% subscription by the final service milestone. So pretty aggressive. As far as the overall network design, you have to describe the proposed last mile architecture, the design and technologies. For example, if you're going to use fiber, if you're going to use unlicensed spectrum, licensed spectrum, if you're going to use coax cable, a digital subscriber line, or a combination of all these. You'll have to describe your proposed middle mile and backhaul technology to move that traffic back and forth between your network. And finally, you'll have to describe that proposed interconnection architecture, design, and technology solution to connect to the internet. This will include the likely service providers, link data rate and size, locations, your dual homing and multi-homing characteristics.
Hey, Jim, that's a good summary of the broadband piece of this. And obviously broadband speeds is what everyone is focused on. But of course, under federal law, voice is required from these networks. So could you also just talk a little bit about the specific elements of the voice part of the network design and technical requirements?
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because voice is, kind of an afterthought. As you said, we all focus on speed. There's the gigabit tier, the 100 megabit tier. There's not a voice tier. Voice is an assumed technology that is provided over this. So it's important that we discuss this. So as you put together your detailed description, you're going to have to describe your proposed architecture to provide voice. That includes your session internet protocol or your SIP proxies, your session border controllers, your various network databases that will control all this. If you, as the long form, as you fill out your long form, will obtain these or other voice services from another provider or providers, for example, an over-the-top VoIP provider, or you're working with an ILEC or a CLEC that will provide that, you need to describe that accordingly. So you're going to have to describe whether the voice services will be internally provided, use a managed service provider, use a voice over the top service, or use another type of voice service. You're also beyond that voice. We then have to get into scalability of the network. So you're going to have to report on how you're going to support customer growth and network data usage to account for the ever-increasing application requirements, the increasing quality demands, and lower response and latency demands for the ever-increasing usage of highly interactive programs. So again, a lot of information has to be provided in this detailed description. You're also going to have to describe the features and design that will improve reliability, that will talk about the links and the software that will be used, your dual homing, as I mentioned, and that multi-homing connectivity.
So Jim, that's a fair amount of detail on network layout. What can you tell us about the requirements for network ownership and design methods?
Yeah, so as you think about your network and how you're going to deploy this network, you really need to think about each component of that network and indicate which parts of the network will use your facilities versus another party's existing facilities. And this includes both the non-wireless or the landline technology and the wireless facilities extending from the customer location all the way back through the network to that internet provider that connects you up to the internet. For facilities that don't exist, you need to indicate whether the new land-based facilities will be aerial, buried, or underground. You need to include lease lines for transit service. And for fixed wireless, you'll need to provide the location of new or rented tower locations of where you'll place your radios. You also have to provide in this technical information basically your design methods, your rules of thumbs, your engineering assumptions. All these used to size the capacity of the network nodes, the links, and on the wireless side, the wireless base station. Information that you provide should demonstrate how the required performance for the relative performance tier that you're in will be achieved during peak usage for both downstream and upstream speeds. And latency, assuming a 70% subscription by the final milestone. You'll need to provide oversubscription ratios applied in the various parts of your network, including middle mile, backhaul, and interconnection network levels that funnel consumer traffic online. As the FCC said, we expect several ratios as they showed in their diagram. And it's not just a simple statement that we'll use a 20-to-1 ratio, as the FCC said. They really want to know that oversubscription ratio in each part of the network. That may be at the internet, at your core routers, your distribution, all the way down to the customer access.
Yeah,
And if
thank,
you-
oh,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
Jim. I was going to say, having been through this process once or twice, I could tell you that there's a lot of detail here, and the FCC doesn't want one of these tell me everything you know about your network with pictures and vendor spec sheets in it. They really want to know, as you said, in the weeds, so you can't really see them, the answer to all these questions. So when they ask about architecture and topology, give them architecture and topology. When they ask about standards, tell them standards. And when they ask about your core and your middle mile and your last mile, you're going to need to respond to all three of those. So, kind of moving on to the next stage, because all this is sort of a setup to the FCC being 100% confident that you're going to be able to meet your performance requirements. So, assuming you jump through all those hoops, what do you need to focus on for purposes of showing the FCC you can meet those performance requirements?
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. What you really need to look at is really how you're going to meet the peak end-to-end performance that you specified in your bid and what you're awarding. And that is from the customer all the way to the internet, that full path. So you're going to, what you're required to provide is the detailed consumer path and use cases on how that traffic will move to and from the customer premise to the internet. So a lot of detailed information that you're going to have to provide on that. You should define the technical planning and capacity requirements that a stream of packets would experience along this path so that the FCC understands and can verify that your design will meet the requirements. In summary, what the FCC is looking for is that individual path use case meets the requirements and that you describe the pathway and the links, whether it's media, technology, data rates, redundancy, whatever it may be, the various oversubscription ratios for fixed wireless. Or for fixed wireless, we want to know about the frequencies, channels, antennas, and wireless parameters. We'll need to know that, or you will need to know, and you will need to describe that topology, whether it's a mesh, a ring, or a hierarchical network. And also note the redundant paths that you have built into this, that multi-homing that we've discussed, so that they understand how that network redundancy will hold up. And then talk about the network devices, the equipment type, the redundancy, the reliability of those devices, the protocols that you may be using. And again, as I've said a number of times, the oversubscription ratios. And if you own the infrastructure or you lease that infrastructure. So with that, I think the listeners would probably like to hear from Steve and John on some of the other pertinent information required in that detailed write-up. So John, can you take us through the program management?
Sure. And we're going to go through a series of steps now, different categories. And I just want to echo what Steve said, which is, on the one hand, you need to view this as not as a less is more process, but a more is more, meaning when the FCC asks the questions in these particular areas, they really want a full answer, not a summary answer, not a hand-waving answer. But they also don't want you to just regurgitate, endless piles of paper and facts. They want it structured and very clearly lined up against their categories, right? So imagine your counterparty here is going to be some knowledgeable expert sort of person at the FCC, a professional engineer, a technical expert, and their job really is to assess each of these areas. And you need to convince them that you've got a plan to actually do what you've said you're going to do, which is build broadband at the speeds that you bid on to the locations that you've won. So the first category is the project plan. So think of this as the sort of operational deployment part of that story. So you've told the FCC that you're going to, over the next 6 years, build out to 40%, 60%, 80%, and then at least 95% of the locations that you've won. First step is, okay, from a construction, deployment, network rollout, network build out standpoint, how do you do that? So, for example, the FCC will want to see what are your deployment plans, whether that's new construction or it's acquiring IRUs or acquiring wholesale spectrum, whatever those steps are. How are you going to do that against the build out schedule in the RDOF rules? So, what is the month, quarter, annual plan for building out each part of the network that will, in a real way allow you to say to the FCC, here is how I'm going to, over the first 3 years, get to 40% of the locations in each state that I've won. And they continue that process all the way up to completing the milestones. I will say, I mean, the FCC understands that you can't set out a plan on, February 1st of 2021 and guarantee that plan won't change at all over the next, 5.5 years. So the idea that over time you might have to adjust some of this is obviously expected. But that said, the plan that you lay out here has to be a one that a knowledgeable person would say, yes, that makes sense. They're not going to second guess your judgment as to, for example, what order or what sequence to cover locations. But the plan that you lay out is one they're going to really kick the tires on and ask questions and try to verify that you really can in fact do it. So bottom line on this is, you're thinking about what is your construction plan, what is your deployment plan, your rollout plan, just all of those elements, the labor required to lay the fiber if that's what you're doing, or to construct new towers if that's what you're doing. What does that plan look like? And the kind of things you should have in mind would literally be monthly, quarterly schedules that show, in this area, these CBGs, this part of the state, we're going to be doing this then, and just show how that all rolls up to actually meeting your obligations over the 6-year time frame.
John, we've all seen project plans of various detail, non-detail. For this, I would guess the FCC is looking for pretty in-depth planning of that network so that they can feel reassured that you know what you're doing. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so again, let's just we're going to go through all the different pieces of the puzzle here. So I was just talking a second ago about the network deployment itself. Okay, the next piece of the puzzle is, okay, great. You may have constructed or in other ways acquired your network. You have deployed the network. How are you going to operate, manage, and run that network, again, to meet the obligations that you signed up for, including making the network available, being able to deploy the network with the 10-day business day service fulfillment time, and in particular do it at the speeds and quality levels that you certified in your bidding. So a nice thing about RDOF and about these programs, though, is you don't have to do it all yourself. The FCC's rules are very clear that as long as the ETC is primarily facilities-based, that primarily it is your network, you are absolutely free to work with all kinds of third parties, service providers, contracts, whatever you want to do to deliver those obligations. And that's what this network management and ongoing operations section really is going to be about. So describe your plans for monitoring network usage and capacity, performance, congestion of the network. We're going to come to this, I think, repeatedly over the next few minutes. The issue of how are you ensuring that you're going to maintain your service levels, your performance levels as customers join your network, as speeds increase, as you grow. How do you guarantee that you're offering whatever speed you guaranteed, not just with your first customer, but with your 10,000th customer? So what are your plans for monitoring, operating, and scaling your network? How do you, over 10 years, make sure that you're making necessary investments, for example, in maintenance capital? What kind of systems will you use to figure out when you have to upgrade certain links? Go ahead and define what your current plan is for who will provide them. Will you have an internal team that does this? Will you use outsourced third parties? Will you add new internal staff, contractors? Again, any of those are fine. You just have to define clearly who they are and how they're going to work with your organization. And put a special star by the performance measures, right? Anyone that's been doing FCC stuff anytime recently knows this issue of how do we know what speed is really being provided? When you say you're offering broadband, what are you really offering? So management and measuring the speed offered is going to be very important to the FCC. And so you need to clearly lay out what is the plan you're going to use to measure the speeds you're delivering and the latencies you're delivering to your customers. Are you going to use sort of an existing thing like Measuring Broadband America, which is pretty well known to the FCC now, some other off-the-shelf system, your own custom one? Again, any of the answers are fine. You just have to lay it out clearly and convince the staff that it's a good, robust way to meet that need.
Okay. So in addition to walking through the network performance and operations, we know the FCC is looking for a network diagram. Can you walk us through what we should prepare in that network diagram as an applicant is completing that?
Sure. Yeah. So again, this is puzzle piece number 3, I guess, on the list. Just again, think about if you had to sit down with a government technical expert, a professional engineer that works for the FCC, and thoroughly describe to him or her what both the physical and logical architecture of your network would be. How are you going to do that? So a network diagram, you need to both clearly lay out wireline segments, wireless segments, how they may change over time. So for example, maybe you're going to start using wireless backhaul for certain towers, but then as you grow your customer base, you're going to replace that with fiber, laying that out clearly. Who are you going to use for interconnection services, right? Are you going to build your own middle mile, your own backhaul? Are you going to lease certain links from certain providers in the given region that you're operating in? What sort of interconnection agreement will you put in place with those providers? Again, just you have lots of flexibility on how you're going to do it. Just lay it out very clearly what your plan is. And again, you got to make sure it's comprehensive. All links, last mile, middle mile, interconnection out to the long haul networks. Got to all be clearly laid out, again, as if you're the CTO of a company was wanting to make sure they really knew what they were doing in the organization. That's the kind of plan you have to lay out. Just to have a quick checklist, you want to make sure that you are uniquely identifying all of the major nodes of the network. So again, think about the different logical nodes, routers for data, SIP proxies, soft switches you're using for voice services, other databases used to create and deliver managed network services, DNS, just all of those elements. Again, you're going to have your own infrastructure, your own equipment, third-party agreements to provide it, but just make sure you're not missing any obvious gaps in those major network nodes. Focus in particular on access nodes, gateways, essentially how your network and what you're deploying as part of this process will then plug into the rest of the broader network ecosystem, if you will. How are you getting to the internet? What redundancy are you having in place? Be specific about standards, technology, types of equipment that you're using. So this is one where you don't want to just throw up a bunch of vendor spec sheets, but you do want to be concrete about what type of equipment you're using and how that's going to fit into your overall plan. And again, make sure you always are tying this back to your number of locations, the number of consumers, and your performance tiers that you've signed up for. And each step along the way, expect the question the FCC is going to ask is both, okay, is this a good, technically sound approach to doing this? And is it a good, technically sound approach to making sure that it can grow and scale over time, maintaining the performance levels that have been signed up for? So again, within that kind of description, more is more in terms of specifics, as long as it's clearly tailored and targeted each of those areas. And again, you're going to have a professional engineer at the FCC looking at all this and asking a lot of hard questions just to make sure that they are convinced that the plan you're laying out is one that will fulfill the obligations that you said that you would deliver.
Got it. Yeah, and this really points out just that the FCC really wants a reassurance before they award any funds that that network that they're funding is going to provide the service that won the bid. So it's really important that you understand what we're talking through and the level of granularity that is needed. Steve, on the terrestrial fixed wireless side, I know there are similarities and differences. Can you kind of walk us through what's needed on the terrestrial fixed wireless?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And like John was saying, it applies to the spectrum piece as well. The FCC is going to want you to be precise, and they're going to want you to be concise. And sometimes it's hard to reconcile the two of those, and that's the iterative process that you'll be going through with the FCC on everything we've talked about, whether it's the network diagram or network performance, or what I'm going to talk about next, which is spectrum, because the staff does have an obligation to be sure that you're to make sure that you are reasonably capable. That's their language, reasonably capable of hitting your performance benchmark. So that's the standard by which you will be evaluated. So when it comes to spectrum, you're going to need to explain with technical detail how your proposed spectrum is going to meet or exceed your relevant performance requirements at peak usage period. So you're going to need to measure your network at that level, and the FCC is going to want you to give them information that measures peak usage periods. You're going to need to clearly identify the licensed and the unlicensed spectrum that you plan to use. And like John said, and it's a very good point, and I was writing it down as he was saying it, you don't have to build exactly what you propose. The FCC understands that technology will evolve, or stuff will happen, or you'll find a cheaper alternative or a better alternative. And maybe you'll decide just to put fiber in, even though you're only obligated to do 100 by 20. That's all going to be fine. Plans will change. The next thing you're going to need to do is provide calculations for each performance tier and frequency band to design the last mile link budgets in both directions, upload and download at the cell edge, using the technical specs of the base stations that you expect to have and the CPE equipment and its performance. So you're going to be submitting assumptions regarding fading statistics, cell edge probability coverage, cell loading for each performance tier that you have signed up for. You're going to be providing coverage maps for your planned or existing networks used to meet those obligations. You're going to indicate where the upload and download speeds will meet or exceed the relevant performance tier speeds. And those maps should be provided for each interim and final service milestone that you have to meet. You're also going to need to provide detailed radio access network infrastructure information that you use to generate coverage maps for each unique cell. Long list of stuff you're going to need to build into that. Lat and long, antenna height, antenna orientation, down tilt, antenna model, antenna system configuration, what's the ERP, what's the operating spectrum amount, what's the type of spectrum, what's the radio technology. You're also going to need to describe the underlying propagation model you used. The FCC is not going to tell you what's right or wrong. They want to make sure that what you're doing is reasonably capable of meeting what you want to do. But it has to include spectrum, antenna height, distance, fade margins, terrain resolution, clutter resolution, provide vendor references and any publicly available publications for that model or that elevation and clutter data. Again, they're not going to tell you what model to use. They're just going to want to make sure that you're using a model and that you're able to defend that model when they ask you about it. You're also going to need to describe the underlying cell site, RF access capacity, network and traffic engineering models, and best practices. So this might include adjunct carrier aggregation or spectrum sharing techniques, or if your proposed system can accommodate those particular features. You're also going to need to describe for each tier the base station equipment that you plan to use. So it's not just listing the equipment, of course, it's the technology, the speed, how many sectors you're going to have, what's the frequency band, what's the bandwidth of the channel, how often are you going to be reusing your frequencies, antenna gain, diversity configuration, estimated losses, height above ground of your base station, lat and long of your planned base station, any other relevant information. And here it can be useful to provide spec sheets from your vendor. The final piece of the spectrum showing is to describe the planned customer premise equipment configuration. And here that includes the technology, frequency band, speed options, antenna gain, diversity scheme, and modem specs. You should also, again, here, feel free to include vendor specs, data sheets, and other supporting documents. So it's a very, very extensive model. And if you're using Spectrum, if you have multiple spectrum bands that are licensed and unlicensed, that makes your job a little bit more challenging. Recently have been through similar processes in CAF and down in the islands, and I could tell you that the FCC will pick apart your technical showing from everything from the network diagram to the spectrum showing to network management very carefully.
Steve, there's one thing came to mind as you were talking through it, and maybe I missed it. And, Is there any guidance on spectral efficiency assumptions that you know of that you should be aware of?
You will have to demonstrate your uplink and downlink and what speeds you're going to be able to get over certain bandwidth, but that's going to depend on what are your standards. Are you using LTE? Are you using something different? What's your clutter model? What's your terrain model? There are certain, I think, assumptions one can make if you're using 60 gigahertz versus 900 megahertz as to how far your signal will travel before it will attenuate and subject to rain fade, and you should expect that the FCC will ask you about that. And anybody who's proposing to do, sort of a 60 gig fixed wireless proposal needs to be able to demonstrate to the FCC that their network can scale up where that becomes something that's that can be demonstrated.
The other thing that you talked about was the propagation models. And I know there's been issues with propagation models in the past as far as non-standardization and just not meeting the criteria. Is there anything about propagation models that the listener should be aware of?
I would just say, if you give them a circle on a map, they're going to think that that really doesn't take into account terrain and clutter. So there's no specific model. It's going to be band specific. It's going to depend on what clutter model you're using. It's going to depend on how much power you're putting in a particular direction. It's going to be dependent on your equipment. There are engineers who can provide that kind of a service and produce propagation maps, or maybe you can do it yourself based on what you've been doing. You just need to be able to explain the methodology to the FCC so they understand it and expect that they're going to try to shoot holes in it so that they can tell their bosses at the FCC, and the people at the FCC can tell those people in Congress who care about this stuff that we think that this particular applicant is reasonably capable of meeting their performance requirements.
Thanks. That's been helpful. The last technology we need to cover is satellite. Can you kind of give us some walkthrough of the satellite requirements?
Sure. So if you're using satellite in your network, you're going to describe to the FCC how many satellites that are in view simultaneously from any specific location that will be required to meet your relevant performance obligations. How many uplink and downlink gateway antenna beams are going to be required for each satellite, and the capacity of each beam in megabits per second. For each area that you're proposing to serve, each state, provide the uplink and downlink beams, gateway call sign, beam ID, frequency bands that you're using, and the location of those gateways, the city and state. You're going to describe how many of these uplink and downlink user antenna beams will be required on each satellite, and the capacity of each beam in, again, megabits per second. Describe how the gateway capacity is connected to user beams on the satellite in terms of beams and data capacity per beam. Describe how much capacity in gigs per second the applicant plans to reserve by state to serve the locations required under their award and to achieve the required service milestones. And finally, satellite applicants need to describe whether the capacity on the uplink and downlink beams is able to be reallocated once a satellite commences operation, and if the subscription rate ends up being less than 70% in one beam, but more than 70% in another beam. So if there are circumstances where the reallocation would not be possible, you're going to need to describe those circumstances and the states that are impacted. This is because the FCC requires you to design your network as if you will have a 70% take rate. You may never hit that, but they're going to ask you and have you design your system, whether it's satellite, terrestrial, fixed wireless, gigabit, or fiber, whatever it happens to be. You're going to need to demonstrate to the FCC that you can design your network to 70%.
Just a question on this, and you may not know. I know SpaceX is one of the winners of the auction. Is there anything specific to low Earth orbit satellites that's differential from what we just talked through?
No, not really. The FCC sort of dealt with that in the rulemaking and indicated to them And we don't know, or at least I don't know, what they were ultimately qualified to bid at. If they were allowed to bid at low latency, we know they were not allowed to bid at gigabit. I think I'm right on that, if I remember correctly. Yeah, John's nodding his head. So the maximum they could bid at is 100 by 20, and I think the latency was subject to the short form. Understand they were successful in winning about $885 million in support. So I haven't looked at where those areas are, but presumably they found a way.
Okay. So I think that kind of wraps up what we wanted to cover in this third and final session. But before we call it a wrap, maybe Steve and John, can you think of anything that we want to tell the listeners to be jumping on right now? You know, what is it that we've learned from CAF2, from the rural experiments that trips up some participants just because they put it off into the future?
Let her credit. Get it moving now if you haven't already, because I think that's the one that in CAF2 at least people didn't realize necessarily how long it might take to get that fully committed. And as Steve said, the obligation or the requirements have been released a little bit for RDOF, so maybe a bit easier, but by far that was the biggest one. And then I would just say making sure if you're not an ETC or are not 100% sure that your ETC status is sufficient, you need to really start understanding what that state process is or the federal process if the state one doesn't apply to you. And those are the two long poles in the tent on schedule, I think.
And I would say on the engineering side, take a look at where your census blocks are. If there are some that just don't make sense because you ended up with some strays over here, you know, think about strategically what you want to do with those. We've talked about defaults. We've talked about the possibility of swapping, because every single census block is going to be subject to scrutiny by FCC staff. Make sure you have good engineering capability, whether it's in-house or out-of-house or a combination, and be responsive to the FCC. They're trying really hard to do this. They've successfully done this in multiple programs. Some of the things they may ask you might seem to be picky or business or nitpicky or you know, things that don't seem to make sense, but understand that they have to be accountable to their bosses, and their bosses ultimately need to be accountable to Congress. And Congress does not want to hear about a lot of folks who are failing. So give that some thought on the front end. Look at you as being the steward of significant capital being contributed by ratepayers, and that there's going to be a lot of oversight of this program. And you're part of it. You're an important part of it. But understand there's a lot of people who are going to be looking at this very carefully.
Thank you, John and Steve. And I personally want to thank both of you for contributing. You are the experts in the field, so it's really good to have you guys talking through this, because I hope it really has informed our listeners over these 3 sessions. And I would, alert you that we will have a live discussion on December 15th. The 3 of us will be there, and we will be taking questions. So as you listen to these, as you look through the public notice that just came out, think of the questions that are top of your mind that we didn't cover, that you haven't seen, or that you're concerned about, and drop it to us beforehand so that we can do some preparation for that. As usual with all live meetings, we won't be able to get through all the questions, but we'll make every attempt to get the questions answered and get you the best information possible. But realize some of us are actually participating with carriers in the RDOF. So we do have some temperance on what we can and cannot say. So with that, I want to just say thank you all. We've come to the end of this last session. This is the last of the pre-recorded events, and we hope you have found this very informative. And please come to our December 15th live event. And as you have those questions, please contact Stephen Mott at smok@costquest.com. Thank you so much.